The medieval animosity of Christians towards Jews found expression in a whole range of legends and stories that detailed the nefarious behavior of those who were thought to hate Christianity and directed in forms of violence and secret activities. We find such story here in a 13th century Spanish account of a miracle. And to talk about it, Nazanin's going to say something about what happens in these extraordinary images.
Yes, so this is from the 13th century, from a sort of a volume called the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the Canticles of Holy Mary, which is a compilation of these beautiful illuminations, songs, and Marian miracles. This one is called The Murdered Chorister, which, frame by frame details a typical case of blood libel, where Jews are accused of killing a Christian child because of their hatred of the Christian faith. So here you have, the devotion to the Virgin Mary, and a young child who sings beautifully in praise of the Virgin. Here you have Jews who, allegedly had heard the child singing, and because of their hatred of Christianity, killed him. So here this sort of gruesome scene, and also these Jews' stereotypical hoods. Right? They bury him in a cellar, but because of the power of Mary, she revives him, and he begins to sing her praises once more, allowing for his family to find him and then burn and punish the Jews who had killed him. But, this is, again, a tale, but very much so that this would often play out for Jews in Spain at this time and across Europe who are accused of murdering Christian children.
So although it's a miracle story, it very much reflects the kind of violence that we find in this culture, not only in Spain, but across Europe.
Exactly. And in fact, one of these blood libel cases in the 15th century actually sparks so much outrage and anxiety that it directly leads to the founding of the Spanish Inquisition.
Yes.
We've seen here.
So let's look at a famous representation of the Spanish Inquisition, the auto de fe. What is that?
So here we have a 17th century representation of, very much the public aspect of the auto de fe and the punishment by the Inquisition. Here you have two penitents surrounded by the crowd, an inquisitor, oftentimes a Dominican friar like we've seen in the medieval Inquisition as well. The auto de fe was very much a public display. This scene takes place right in the center of Madrid, the Plaza Mayor, which you can still go to today.
And finally, we have this document over here. Can you say what it is?
So this is actually the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews in 1492. You have here the royal signatures and the royal seal, which was pronounced really after the taking of Granada and the sort of completion of the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, right? Once that the Ferdinand and Isabella had completed their Catholic sort of taking over and driving out of Muslim forces, they then wanted an entirely Catholic state that left no room for the Jews.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. The Spanish Inquisition, although most associated with the late medieval and early modern worlds, actually lasted till 1834. Its name is synonymous with cruelty and persecution. And while much of the polemic was in the hands of its enemies, there's no doubt that the Inquisition did use torture and humiliation on its victims. Yet the story of the Inquisition is complex. There was often considerable difference between the theory of how it should operate and how it did actually take place in practice. The effectiveness of the Inquisition varied from region to region. Already in the Roman Empire, the Inquisition took a form which was action against heresy. Heresy, that is, theological error. Roman law, such as Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis of 534, made use of the Inquisition process to persecute heretics By the Middle Ages, papal and secular mandates had developed so that the papacy had greater control over the system. Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century was particularly notable. The inquisitors were chosen from the mendicant orders, the Dominicans, as we've already heard. And by 1249, the routine of the inquisitors was established. In the process, those who confessed were reconciled to the church following penance. Those who refused to confess were publicly punished. And in particularly severe cases, houses might be destroyed, there might be life imprisonment. Secular authorities, not ecclesiastical, might put a person to death at the stake. This is significant to know because the Spanish Inquisition owed a great deal to the Roman and medieval developments. For both, only baptized Christians were of interest because you had to be baptized in order to be a heretic. Many of the same practices were kept. Investigation, the central role of confession, the interrogation of families, the rule of secrecy, torture, confiscation of property, and possibly death penalties. Also, there was in Spain, as there had developed in the medieval period, an emphasis on written records. In Spain, as the Inquisition appeared, there was considerable conflict between the inquisitors and local churches. And because it was the inquisitors who were given particular authority for the prosecution of heresy. So as I say, the Spanish Inquisition owed much to its predecessors, but it was also unique. Created in 1478 to take on Judaizers, as they were known. Christians who continued to practice Jewish rites, Jews who had been converted from the end of the 14th century, mostly in forced conversions and baptisms. They were known as new Christians, or conversos. The question that arose was whether those who had been forced to convert and were baptized, whether those conversions were sincere. And some of the resentment against these conversos was due to their success in both economics and politics. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella heard the Dominican Alonso de Ojeda preach about the terrible situation in Spain. He argued that Judaizing Christians were practicing Mosaic law. In 1478, a papal bull granted the Spanish monarchs the right to implement the Inquisition. The inquisitors were loyal to the king and queen, not the papacy. The early years of the Inquisition were dominated by organizational and jurisdictional complications. And in 1483, Pope Sixtus IV named Thomas de Torquemada, the Dominican prior, as Spain's first Inquisitor General. This gave him power over Aragon and Castile. Between 1480 and 1521, the main target of the Inquisitions were these conversos, or Judaizing Christians as they were thought to be. Many baptized men and women were arrested, and it was believed that the converso population was actually extremely large. It was those people who were accused of following Jewish dietary laws and practices and being influenced by the Jews themselves. It was at this point that Isabella and Ferdinand were persuaded to start expelling Jews from Spanish cities. The Inquisition recommended the expulsion of all Jews. When, as we've heard, Ferdinand conquered Granada in 1492, Christianity, in a way, had triumphed in Spain. This led, in March 1492, to the edict to expel the Jews from Aragon and Castile. They were given a choice: either accept Christian baptism or leave. When prominent Jews sought to intervene, Ferdinand extended the deadline to 1499. Many of the Jews went to Portugal, but they were forced to leave there. And it's been estimated that something in the range of 150,000 Jews left Spain at this point. The Inquisition trials were carried out with witnesses making statements under oath, which later had to be confirmed. The prosecutors laid out the accusations, and those charged did not know who were the witnesses against them, nor did they have much chance of making a defense. If there was resistance or ambiguity, there would be recourse to torture. And those forms of torture varied from pouring water down the nose, the rack, to being hung by one's wrists. Prisoners, on the whole, were presumed to be guilty, and the verdicts depended on the form of offense they were deemed to have committed. Those who confessed might be reconciled to the church. Death at the stake was for the unrepentant and those who lapsed back into heresy. One of the worst penalties was galley service in the Spanish ships. In heresy cases, all goods of the person accused were taken, confiscated. Most of the condemned were put through acts of faith, the auto de fe that we've referred to, which were large spectacles, as we saw in this 17th century representation. Sentences were read aloud, and defendants wore symbols of the penalties, such as a rope. People might be required to wear red smocks with yellow crosses in public. The auto de fe was a public statement against heresy. It was intended to make a powerful impression on the people. As we see here, they are gathered around to observe the spectacle. It was also a form of entertainment. The attacks on the conversos began to decline around the year 1510. And after the Reformation of Martin Luther, from 1521 to 1535, there was a hunt for anyone who showed sympathy for the evangelical teaching. This included the so-called alumbrados, the illuminated ones who were in Toledo. During the reign of Philip II, many of the Portuguese conversos were able to return to Spain on account of their wealth. But by the second half of the 16th century, there was yet another change. This time against Muslims who had converted to Christianity, known as Moriscos. And they came under the scrutiny of the Inquisition. After the fall of Granada, Muslims had initially been permitted to retain their property, but they were evangelized, often in Arabic. Under Cardinal Cisneros, mass baptisms and forced conversions began to take place. Mosques were turned into churches. 1502, Muslims in Castile were told, like the Jews had been told, to convert or leave. And by 1526, just over 20 years later, Muslims in Spain were officially regarded as Christian. There was considerable opposition in Spain to the forced conversions of the Muslims. And after 1560, the number of persecutions of Moriscos before the Inquisition began to rise. The charges were for practicing Islamic customs after baptism, being required to stop wearing traditional dress, customs, and religious practices led to a revolt amongst the Moriscos against Philip II, a revolt that was crushed. The Moriscos themselves were expelled in 1609. And in this case, it's thought to have been a number around 300,000. The Inquisition waned ultimately during the 18th century, and it would be brought to an end by no less than Napoleon himself. It was briefly restored, but to no effect. And then, finally, this institution, so notorious in Protestant polemic, came to a quiet end in 1834.